Well, welcome everyone. My name is Hadley German, and I am the Eugene B. Adkins Curator at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art at the University of Oklahoma. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which brings together cities, museums, galleries, art historians, and yes, mayors to explore the roles of Oklahoma City and Los Angeles in the career of the major contemporary artist, Ed Ruscha. Throughout the webinar, we welcome you to post questions or comments to our panelists in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Time permitting, our panelists will respond to your questions at the end of the program today. I'm now pleased to introduce to you our special guests. Joining us on behalf of the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art is Dr. Mark White, former director of the museum and curator of the exhibition OKLA. He is now the executive director of the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe, and Mark will share an overview of OKLA and moderate today's panel discussion. Welcome, Mark. Joining us on behalf of Oklahoma Contemporary are two art historians, Dr. Alexandra Schwartz and Dr. Kirsten Olds. Dr. Schwartz, a New York-based independent curator and scholar, co-curated Oklahoma Contemporary's new exhibition, Ed Ruscha, OKLA. Dr. Olds, a faculty member and associate dean at the University of Tulsa, contributed to the catalog that accompanies the exhibition. We're so pleased to have you both on hand today. Last but certainly not least, we are fortunate to have with us Mayor David Holt of Oklahoma City and Mayor Eric Garcetti of Los Angeles. We are especially thankful to Mayor Holt for the idea behind today's webinar. We'll look forward to hearing from both of you, Mayor Holt and Mayor Garcetti, throughout the discussion. Well, without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to our moderator, Dr. Mark White, who will kick off the conversation by sharing with us about OKLA. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Hadley. And it's great to be part of this fascinating program. Actually, I want to throw out a question before I get started on talking about the OKLA exhibition at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. Mayor Holt, this is a really great idea to bring together these two landmark exhibitions, both of which are in the metro area. I wonder, what was it that led to this idea? Why did you think that this was something that needed to happen?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having us, and thanks for doing all the legwork. And I'll credit, actually, my colleague, Mayor Garcetti. I sent him the article that Brandy McDonald with the Oklahoman wrote a few weeks ago about the contemporary exhibition. And he immediately responded after reading it and said, you know, I'd be willing to do a panel or have a conversation about Ed Ruscha and the linkages between our two cities. I assumed that he understood implicitly that that's way more fun than anything else he or I usually get to do. So I see why he threw that out there. And I followed up. I mean, you know, I'm not going to let an offer like that be considered insincere. I was going to hold him to it. So I followed up with you guys at Fred Jones and our friends at Contemporary. And it's just such an interesting, fun time right now that you've got these two exhibitions. One's about to conclude. One is just getting started. Both focused on, one primarily on Ed Ruscha, one partly on Ed Ruscha. And I just thought it was a great opportunity. And I just love how beautiful it is that it all came together. And we have, two mayors and two museums and one very important figure in the history of American art. So thank you guys for putting it together. And I think this is really cool and a great opportunity to elevate Ed Ruscha, who I think sometimes is considered a bigger deal in LA than he is in OKC. And I'm sure we'll talk about that over the course of the hour, but that is something I want to rectify. And that's the number one reason why this program is so important today.
Well, I agree, and I hope more Oklahomans will pay closer attention to Ed Ruscha after the Oklahoma Contemporary Show and the Fred Jones Jr. Show. So I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you for helping to organize this program. This is fantastic. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fred Jones Jr. Show, and I do have a question for Mayor Garcetti that I'm going to slide into my part of the presentation before I hand it over to Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Olds for their part of the program. Okay, so how about the first slide? Okay, so you see here a photograph from 1959, and in this photograph you have four recent transplants to Los Angeles from Oklahoma City. Starting at the left, you see Joe Good, Jerry McMillan, Ed Ruscha, and Patrick Blackwell, all of whom had gone to high school in Oklahoma City, but decided to go to art school at the Chouinard Art Institute. And it was largely Ed Ruscha that prompted this migration from Oklahoma City to LA. And I will talk about why that is over the course of my talk, but these four individuals are really the core of the exhibition at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art, which is OKLA, a slash between OK and LA, to emphasize not only that they were from Oklahoma, but they ultimately arrived in LA and made their careers in LA. And that exhibition was intended to examine the career of these four artists, as well as two others, Mason Williams, who is less an artist than a cultural figure. He's an author, a musician, a comedian. He's really kind of a Renaissance man when it comes to entertainment, but also Ed's younger brother, Paul. So the intent of that exhibition was to really examine these six Oklahomans, all of whom made their careers in Los Angeles, Southern California, and they were central to this project. They saw the exhibition as really kind of a sense of coming home back to Oklahoma City, a way of showcasing what they had done abroad in LA over the past 60 years. And in that respect, the exhibition was kind of an autobiographical history of their friendships, their professional relationships over those decades. And to that end, the exhibition, at least for me, I really wanted to explore how Oklahoma had played into their collective contribution to contemporary art in Southern California, which included key developments in pop art and conceptual art, but all without losing sight of how California had also informed that. So it really does become an exhibit about their shared history, and that would include collaborative projects, inside jokes, parallel interests, etc. So with these four artists, they will form the core of what they call the Students Five. They form a group that includes different artists at different times, although these four are almost always the core of that Students Five group. And at one point, it includes an artist from St. Louis, Wall Batterton. It includes another Oklahoman, Don Moore, who unfortunately we've lost touch with. But the idea of reuniting the Students Five was actually that of Ed's brother, Paul. Next slide, please. And here you see Paul Ruscha and Ed Ruscha from a photograph from 2017. And back in 2015, when I really got to know Paul, we were talking about his history with his brother and his friends. And he said, you know, it would really be a great idea to bring back the Students Five. And I thought it was a fascinating idea, but I wanted there to be space for both Paul and Mason, also Oklahoma expatriates who had made their careers in Los Angeles. And so that's ultimately how the show took shape. It was Paul's initial idea that led to the eventual exhibition that opened at the Fred last year. So what takes them to LA, though? Let's answer that question. Next slide, please. So Ed Ruscha and Mason Williams go to Los Angeles in 1956. Ed is going to hopefully have a career at the Art Center School. He actually has an ambition at that point to be kind of an industrial designer, to design automobiles. He finds that he can't get in, so that's why he winds up going to Chouinard Art Institute, because the Art Center was full at that point. Mason, of course, at this point is an aspiring musician and is going to LA to hopefully make his career as a musician. But one of the reasons that LA drew them, not just its entertainment complex, was also sort of the youthful romance of Los Angeles. When Ed is thinking about where he's going to go to college, Los Angeles pops into his mind, partly because of a youthful trip in the 1940s. And as Ed recalled, he remembered palm trees swaying, and that was just too delightful of a lure to avoid. And so it is that romance of Los Angeles that ultimately drives Ed, and Mason out to the city. And I thought that a great expression of that was Jerry McMillan's piece that you see here on the screen from 1971. It is an untitled piece, a copper silhouette of the Los Angeles skyline based on a photograph that he took in 1962. Now, this is an image of Los Angeles that probably none of us have ever seen, given our ages, because at this point, City Hall was still the tallest building on the skyline. That changes in 1968. And so what Jerry tried to do here is to create sort of an image of that kind of romance of Los Angeles. And that leads me to my question for Mayor Garcetti. This 1962 image really does represent a kind of nostalgic image of Los Angeles. And I'm wondering whether or not this kind of romance still informs the city's identity at some level.
Well, thank you, Mark. And thank you to my brother, Mayor David Holt, who's a good friend, personal friend. I'm really excited to do this. There's a modern day connection between our cities, between the two of us. You know, Mayor Holt's come out here and confessed that Los Angeles is his second favorite city. I've been to Oklahoma City and done the same thing with him. So we really have a dear friendship, and I'm really excited to be able to kind of talk about the connection between our two cities. But let me answer your question with what you see here in this incredible kind of iconic image. And it's great to see City Hall, where I'm actually speaking from right now in front of a Ed Ruscha painting, to be able to look at the picture that you've given me to look at and to think about the way we're all looking at each other right now. But certainly I think, you know, Los Angeles has been defined by three things that you see and feel in this. It's freedom, kind of wide open spaces, and the lack of hierarchy, the horizontality, not just literally, but metaphorically. So that freedom. Second, creativity, which these men and this piece embodies, which is kind of just, we attract the most creative people, whether they grow up here or come to here in the world. And third, a sense of belonging. And maybe sometimes Los Angeles isn't, that third one isn't something people jump to, but it is a place where it doesn't matter where you come from. You can be, you know, a 20 or 30th generation descendant of our native Tongva and Chumash tribes. You can be somebody who got off a plane yesterday. And LA is a place where you feel like you belong. If that's romance, then yes, we still have plenty of romance left. But it is a different city now than it was then. It's kind of waking up. And I think the reason Oklahoma City and Oklahoma and LA kind of connected is we're not a West Coast city that's in the same mold as some other places like San Francisco that were let in by the sea. We're really filled in by land. And, you know, where New York and San Franciscans kind of can, folks from New York and folks from San Francisco can feel a familiar tapestry in how the city is built. LA is this sprawling city, just like Oklahoma is this sprawling city. But we finally come to a place maybe that Oklahoma City will get to one day of that density, calling into question what is that next iteration of our romance. This is an imperfect paradise. We don't sugarcoat our problems or challenges, but we still are very romantic, whether it's pursuing the Olympics and welcoming people to come here, whether it's building a new city on top of the one we have now. I think this always attracts and keeps dreamers, even in tough years like this. So I would say, yes, that romance is alive and well, even if that skyline is way filled in since this was made.
Well, thank you, Mayor Garcetti. That was a great answer. And I'm glad you found something in Jerry's piece to really respond to. Okay, next slide, please.
By the way, Eric only gives great answers, but he still likes to hear that that's the case.
Pressure.
Well, that's what got you elected mayor, right? Is those great answers. Throughout their careers, these artists really do explore a tension between the influences of their childhood home and the lure of La La Land, to use a phrase. Ed Ruscha kind of reflected on this back in 1990 in terms of his own wanderlust with a painting titled No Man's Land, which is in the collection of the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art and is in some ways kind of what began the relationship with the Ruschas and that museum. In No Man's Land, what Ed did is to include a silhouette of the state of Oklahoma in the upper left, but the vast majority of the painting is unresolved as a sort of gray color field with a large question mark. The title in this case is a reference to the Panhandle. The Panhandle in the early part of the 20th century was known as No Man's Land because it belonged to God but no man. And it is a place that Ed very much likes to visit when he returns to Oklahoma, even though he still has friends and family in Oklahoma City, and that becomes his destination when he returns to the state. He likes to take long drives, often through the Panhandle, because there's something about the landscape that really appeals to him. But this painting is also about his desire to explore what lay outside of Oklahoma. And in the 1950s, he begins hitchhiking around the country, and it is ultimately that wanderlust that leads him to Los Angeles. Next slide, please. And for Mason Williams, it was also that interest in continuing his music career, something that he had begun in Oklahoma, but it is the sort of folk bluegrass scene in Los Angeles that also attracts him. That Bakersfield sound that actually has its origins in Oklahoma with the 1930s Okies that head to Los Angeles seeking a better life, something away from the Dust Bowl. So in a way, Mason is kind of going to be part of a sound that originated in his home state. But here you see Mason in a shot taken by Jerry, downtown LA, 7th Street, somewhere in the intersection of either Grand Avenue or Hope. So this is right before traffic begins, which even at this point, this would have been a busy downtown intersection. And Jerry recalled that they were constantly worried about being arrested by the police for being a public nuisance. But that was part of the charm of this, is that Mason and Jerry and Ed, they always had a very healthy disrespect for established mores. And Mason strolling down 7th Street, strumming his banjo like some sort of wandering troubadour is very much a part of that sort of counterculture spirit that would inform much of their careers. Okay, next slide, please. And that tension between Oklahoma and Los Angeles is constantly visible in their work, even if it's not always evident. In Ed Ruscha's insects portfolio, he produced 6 prints, all of insects and a kind of hypothetical infestation that was actually inspired by a real infestation of cockroaches in his studio. But in order to kind of really drive this home, he placed that entire suite of prints into a portfolio that included dirt from Oklahoma City. You see on the left, the cover of that portfolio, that's all dirt from Hawthorne Elementary, where he and his brother and his friends all went to elementary school. And so one day Ed calls Paul up and says, "Paul, I want you to go out to the playground of Hawthorne Elementary, dig up a bunch of dirt and mail it to me in Los Angeles." Paul does that, and that ultimately becomes the grit for the front of that portfolio. By the way, a fun story about this, you can kind of see on the print that all of the insects have shadows, and all of those shadows lean towards the lower right. Well, the inside joke there is that Ed wanted to give all of the insects a 5 o'clock shadow, and so the shadows point towards 5 o'clock. Thank you for Paul. Thank you to Paul for sharing that story with me. Okay, next slide, please. In some cases, that tension between Oklahoma City and Los Angeles is more evident, say in the works of Jerry McMillan, when he created a sort of autobiographical suite of photographs, which included his self-portrait in the upper left. He also wanted to include the states that had informed his identity. In this case, California in the upper right, Oklahoma in the lower left, and finally Texas in the lower right, where his father's family was from. And so Jerry saw himself as existing between these different geographical areas, and all of which informed his career as an artist. Next slide, please. And certainly you can take the boys out of Oklahoma, but you can't always take the Oklahoma out of the boys. for the cover of an exhibition catalog in 1968 for Newport Beach, Ed conceives of the idea to put he and his friend Joe Good, also a celebrated Los Angeles artist, on horseback, and they would take a couple of shots in Griffith Park. And so here you see the two really sort of dressed up as cowboys, ostensibly identifying them with Oklahoma. Have to remember that this is also still the heyday of the cinematic Western, many of which are being shot in Southern California. And just to give you kind of some context, 1968, we see really pivotal Westerns like Bandolero, Hang 'em High, Will Penny, and even Once Upon a Time in the West, although that obviously has nothing to do with LA. But here they're sort of playing the role of the contemporary cowboy. Okay, next slide. And even Joe Good's Tornado series, which would seem to refer mostly to Oklahoma. After all, this series is based on a series of entries in one of Gary England's books about Oklahoma tornadoes. But it has as much to do with Oklahoma and its meteorological history as it does with Los Angeles. Joe produced all of these paintings in Los Angeles, obviously miles and miles away from any tornadoes. And he did so using Japanese techniques, ukiyo-e drawing, ink drawing, and paper that he derived from Hiromi Paper Incorporated, a celebrated art paper supply company in Los Angeles. And so these are paintings that very much have something to do with both areas. And finally, the last slide, and then I'll hand over to Alexandra and Kirsten. When we began this project, I began meeting with all of the artists and definitely wanted their input in how they saw their lives, careers, and how their time in Los Angeles and their childhood and adolescence in Oklahoma had informed their careers over the years. And I was surprised then 2 years later when I walked into Joe Good's studio after meeting with him in 2015 to find that he was working on a new series called Cross Currents. And for many people who walked into that studio, they didn't initially recognize what Joe was after. But to me, perhaps because I was in the weeds on this show, I realized that Joe was conflating the silhouette of Oklahoma, the silhouette of California, to really explore his artistic roots. And the title of this, I think, is very important. A cross current is something that is a current that flows across another current. It's a momentary intersection that produces turbulence. For Joe, that turbulence is the creative act. And so his work, like that of his lifelong friends and colleagues, lies at the intersection of those two currents. And so I thought this was kind of a suitable inclusion for the show and a suitable way to conclude my summary of the OKLA exhibition at Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. Now, to introduce Alexandra Schwartz and Kirsten Olds, who will tell us a little bit about Ed Ruscha, OKLA, at the Oklahoma Contemporary.
Thanks, Mark, kind of for that. And I'm excited to be here and touch just a little bit on what I take up in my essay for the Ed Ruscha OKLA catalog, which touches on a number of the themes actually that you raised about kind of confluences and connections. And that's the kind of cultural climate in Oklahoma in the 1940s and 50s in which Ed Ruscha is growing up. It's very much a location in the crossroads, advancing its own individual character, while also sharing some of the changes that are happening on a national scale. Cities like Oklahoma City, where Ruscha's family lived, are expanding and urbanizing, but then they often give way somewhat abruptly to prairie and farmlands, which you can see here fading in the background. Next slide, please. Signs call out to motorists and pedestrians, kind of beseeching them to stop in and spend money and time in mom and pop operations as we see some of the effects of the post-war boom. Next slide, please. While at the same time, national chains and their products are sprouting across the country, encouraged by the development of the interstate highway system, expanding media technologies. So people are fueling their vehicles at Texaco, they're eating Spam, sleeping at Holiday Inns in a way that someone in Texas, Colorado, or even California could also be doing. Next slide, please. The art world in Oklahoma also evinces kind of these forces of continuity and change. Artists in this period were both engaging in representational modes and regional subjects and exploring abstraction. There's a crossover in these approaches as well, where an artist such as Dole Reed, that we see on the left, was innovating within the medium of printmaking, and John O'Neill on the right, choosing the familiar motif of the urban landscape to explore color, space, form. Next slide. This period, the 1940s and 50s, was also a time for the institutionalization of art in Oklahoma, with the Oklahoma Art Center founded in 1945, and so that's kind of what's pictured here. The founding of the Thomas Gilcrease Museum here in Tulsa in 1949, the formation of smaller galleries and exhibition spaces, and the establishment of important recurrent juried art shows. The varied programming promoted by the Museum of Art at the University of Oklahoma, so now known as the Fred, and the Oklahoma Art Center brought the stylistic range and experimentation to a wider public than just kind of university corridors. Next slide, please. And over AM radio, both jazz and country music played, as well as top 40, big band, and other tunes. And so here we can see in these two drum skins with the double negative construction. So I didn't do nothing about it. I never done nobody no harm. Ruscha is conjuring some of the same folksy air we get from, Woody Guthrie's lyrics or Mama's Kitchen. The text here is an equivalent of sorts to the regionalist subject matter of artists whose work appeared in living rooms across the country due to programs like Associated American Artists. So in conclusion, before I pass it over to Alexandra Schwartz, what I hope I've offered in this kind of really brief snippet is that perhaps when Ruscha drove west to California, he nonetheless carried a little bit of Oklahoma with him, inflected in his language maybe, in the food he ate, the stuff he consumed, or the memories he held. When a saying is plucked from the running stream of conversation, when a sign is orphaned from its facade, in a painting, when we zoom in on the emblem on our cars, it's kind of like trying to pull text out of its context. In the 1940s and 50s, Oklahoma offered a rich context for Ruscha's eventual text, revealing kind of the crossroads and confluences, even the cross currents of a state at the dead center of America. And so now Alexandra Schwartz will delve into the detail about the exhibition Ed Ruscha, OKLA, that she co-curated.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you to everyone for inviting me to be part of this. I'm really pleased to be talking about the exhibition in this context. I actually have been writing on Ruscha's work and working with him for about 20 years. And until recently, until Jeremiah Davis, my co-curator at the Contemporary, invited me to do this show with them, my focus had mostly been on his connections to LA. But knowing his work and knowing how he's spoken about his work over the years and having spoken to him over the years, I knew that Oklahoma was very close to his heart and that he was always thinking about it as he was making his work, creating his style, starting out. So as we were putting the show together, we were going through his full body of work and homing in on works that seemed to speak in one way or another to his connections to Oklahoma, to his childhood, to this kind of set of core influences that run throughout his career. And as we were doing that, 5 themes started to emerge, and the show at the Contemporary is structured around these themes in terms of its installation. The catalog is structured that way as well. So the first of these is called Oklahoma OK. And it's really well represented by the work that you see here, which is called Oklahoma E. It's from 1962, so a very early work in Ed's career. And you see here the influence of that graphic arts training that Mark mentioned earlier, this very kind of beautifully rendered serif type E that he's drawn by hand. And then you see at the bottom of it, he has reproduced quite faithfully the comics page of the Oklahoma City newspaper, so the funny pages. And he talked a lot about how comics and aspects of popular culture that he grew up with in Oklahoma City were really important to him as he was developing his work, and put him in this category of pop art that he's often been associated with. So you can see the actual drawings themselves that he's replicated, the title, the date, all that kind of thing. Next slide, please. The second theme that jumped out at us, we gave the title 51% Angel, 49% Devil, and it has to do with his Catholic upbringing. He came from a rather devout family, especially his father, grew up going to church. And until recently, he has not spoken directly about the influence of Catholicism very much, but it's there throughout his work. He describes himself as a lapsed Catholic and actually talks about giving up the church when he went to Los Angeles. But certain words that refer to the idea of spirituality, morality, notions of heaven and hell come up a lot. And this work is particularly interesting in that regard. It's called Miracle from 1999. He deals with the idea of miracles again and again in his work. Sometimes it's using the word. So many of his works focus on verbal language, as Kirsten was referring to. And in this case, you have this ray of light that seems to be cast across the image. That is, Ed has said, a very direct reference to the use of light that you see in a lot of religious painting from the Renaissance onward. Caravaggio is someone who particularly has been interesting to him, and the idea of light being miraculous in this work that was commissioned by the Catholic Church or related to Catholicism. So here we have Miracle in that sense. He also did a really wonderful short film called Miracle that's on view at the Contemporary show, in which it's a miracle that happens to a car mechanic as he's working on a carburetor. So it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek, very pop culture inflected examination of the idea of a secular miracle. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Ed has always been really interested in popular culture. And when he was starting out, he was very much considered part of the West Coast branch of pop art. And as you saw in the Oklahoma E work, comics are a huge part of his work. They come up again and again, movies, music. But something that I became really intrigued with in putting together this show is that the popular culture of food, if you will, is also really important to him. Kirsten mentioned Spam and this sort of mass manufacturing of food that was happening around the US in the post-war period. So there's this kind of common denominator among what people were eating increasingly, and food has its own particular culture. So this work is called Chocolate Room. It's from 1970, and I was really excited to have this work in the show because it's very rarely seen. I actually had never had the opportunity to see it until this exhibition. In 1970, Ed was invited to take part in the Venice Biennale, the international exhibition of contemporary art that happens every 2 years in Venice, Italy. And he had been experimenting with food. He had done a series of prints that used food as the printing medium, caviar, milk, wine, etc. He'd also done a portfolio that was just little drops of liquid from those foodstuffs. And so he decided to kind of take his interest in working with food, quite literally, in a new direction for the Venice project. And he decided to make this room in which he silk screened chocolate onto multiple pieces of paper and then hung them in this kind of shingle style in this room on 3 walls. This is the only work of installation art that he has ever done. And it's very distinctly Ruscha. It's got this sense of humor to it. It's got this, reference to popular culture. In Italy, he used Nestle chocolate because it was very popular in Venice and across Italy, a European brand. But in the US, it's always been done with Hershey's. So that's kind of another way in which he's tapping into this notion of food as popular culture. So when you go into this work, you are overwhelmed by the scent of chocolate. We've been joking that Jeremiah has made sure that there's chocolate available in the Contemporaries gift shop because we have a feeling people will be craving it. And it also, this work changes over time. So you can see that already the chocolate is kind of changing consistency. It loses its scent to some extent, but the look of it changes as the chocolate oxidizes and kind of wears over time. So the next slide, please.
If Mayor Garcetti comes and visits, can he eat that exhibit? Would we allow that?
I'm not sure he would want to eat what's on the wall, but I definitely recommend going to the gift shop. The fourth theme is Route 66, which has a huge role in Ruscha's art. He drove Route 66 with Mason Williams when he first moved from Oklahoma City to Los Angeles, and has driven back and forth on Route 66 innumerable times over the course of his career, coming back to Oklahoma City to visit family. And it's come up in his art many, many times too, probably most famously with the book 26 Gasoline Stations. But something that we were really interested in addition to the notion of car culture and life on the road, Western expansion, manifest destiny even, is that the oil and gas industry is so crucial to the economies of both Oklahoma and also Los Angeles. So we were really interested to go into his work and notice the works that were explicitly about oil and gas. And this is a really early print, again, from 1962, that combines the word gas, that interest in verbal language, with iconography about the gas industry, you could say, and also what, of course, fuels these road adventures. Next slide, please. And finally, Made in USA examines Ed's views of American history, identity, and industry. It's kind of interesting to think about this within the context of his observations about the oil and gas industries, because America's role in the world, its industry, the kind of ways in which American industry has shifted, often abroad over the last 50 years or so, has always been of great concern to him. And although through most of his career, he was quite determinedly apolitical, recently he's become much more overtly political in talking about the role of the US in the greater world and what is happening across the country, but I think especially in the center of the country where he's from. So this is a lithograph that is based on a series of paintings that he did, and it's called Course of Empire. He seems to be referring quite overtly to the idea of American empire here. And the works you see on the left, the images on the left, are black and white paintings that he made of different kinds of industrial buildings. So tech chem, a telephone booth, a tire store. So there we see them in their first state. And then on the right, you see them in a second state. And it shows these changes that have happened to these buildings and kind of metaphorically to American industry over time. So some of the things are simply gone, like the telephone booth. The tire store has been converted to this kind of office park type building. And he seems to be commenting on how American industry has been suffering, how the kind of built environment of American industry has transformed into something new. And it was based on a series of paintings called Course of Empire by the 19th century American artist Thomas Cole, which really shows the rise and fall of a civilization through a series of paintings. They're in the collection of the New York Historical Society. So it's a very interesting commentary from Ed in a rather abstracted way, but I think quite kind of sharp in its way of thinking about American culture. So I will hand it back over to the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Kirsten. I have a couple of questions that I want to direct, I think, first to Mayors Holt and Mayor Garcetti, and then we'll circle back to Alexandra and Kirsten and ask them a question. Mayor Holt, first one is for you. So Ed Ruscha, as well as Joe Good, Jerry McMillan, Mason Williams, and Patrick Blackwell left Oklahoma City back in the late 1950s. Paul Ruscha follows his elder brother later in the early 1970s. Although they frequently return to visit family and friends, they've been expatriates for the majority of their careers. Why do you consider it important for Oklahoma City and its citizens to reflect on their careers?
Well, you know, we're always very proud and grateful for the artists who stay in Oklahoma City or stay in the state of Oklahoma. And by artists, I mean, you know, the full spectrum. Obviously, we're often most noted for some of our musical artists. But what I have found kind of throughout my adult life as a person who's really engaged in the civic life of Oklahoma City is that it is so critically important that we also value expatriates who have made an enormous contribution to the cultural life of the nation. And sometimes some of those people have fallen through the cracks, or maybe their contribution didn't resonate with Oklahoma City through the decades, but maybe it does today, and we need to revisit that collective decision that we might have made to sort of overlook their contribution. And let me tell you some examples to kind of put Ed Ruscha in context too. I spent a not insignificant part of my 20s getting this community to embrace the Flaming Lips. You know, they live here. And they were like way bigger everywhere else. A lot of people probably thought they lived in Los Angeles because they were just so cool, but they actually lived here. They do live here, you know, and I thought that was really important to Oklahoma City's cultural life that we embrace something that weird. And another thing comes to mind. I was a founding member of the Ralph Ellison Foundation here in Oklahoma City, partly because I really, really wanted our city to embrace Ralph Ellison, who grew up here. Similar time frame. I mean, maybe a little earlier than Ed Ruscha, but you know, I mean, similar time frame of his life. He kind of spent his whole childhood here and then left about college age and made a profound impact on the civil rights of our country and the literary life of our country. And again, maybe that didn't resonate fully with the people of Oklahoma City in the 1950s and 1960s, and maybe it wasn't as appreciated here as it should have been. And so again, I've tried to I've dedicated not a few years of my life to elevating Ralph Ellison's visibility and presence here in Oklahoma City. And I feel like Ed Ruscha fits right into that, you know. The reasons he left are probably complex, but it may be true that decades and decades ago that, you know, the art that Ed Ruscha was creating wasn't as accessible to the people of Oklahoma City. But today, and the creation of Oklahoma Contemporary just in the last year is a perfect example of that. That's where our heads are at now. You know, we want to be on the cutting edge of the cultural life of this nation, and that needs to include a full embrace of an artist like Ed Ruscha, who is our hometown boy. And I suspect that his his name ID, to borrow a political phrase that Eric would know, is not that high in Oklahoma City compared to how it might be in Los Angeles. You know, the last time I was in Los Angeles was for the OU-UCLA game. Eric and I got to do the coin toss at that game. That was a couple years ago, and I couldn't escape Ed Ruscha. What's that?
So that was a very close game.
The coin toss was the most competitive aspect.
Exactly.
I couldn't escape Ed Ruscha. You know, we went to the museum, and there he was. I visited a friend's house, and there is a book about him was right inside the doorway. I opened up the LA Times, and there was an advertisement borrowing some of his work and his words. I mean, he was ubiquitous, and he needs to have that same visibility in Oklahoma City if we expect to really participate fully in the cultural life of this nation. And I think America's 25th largest city should expect to do that. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but Ed Ruscha needs to matter in Oklahoma City, just like the Flaming Lips and Ralph Ellison and everybody else who comes from this place and has made really important and monumental contributions to the arts in this country.
Yes, I agree completely. So very well put. Mayor Garcetti, I might flip the question a little bit. Ed Ruscha and his brother Paul and his friends have been part of the cultural fabric of Los Angeles for roughly 60 years. What does their legacy, which is still ongoing, mean to the City of Angels?
Well, you're right. It absolutely is still ongoing, and it kind of defined a moment, and it continues to define a moment. It chronicles, you know, I think his books, for instance, are the encyclopedia of Los Angeles, whether it's apartments, whether it's swimming pools, whether it is palm trees, whether it is cacti, you know, the way that he went through and basically captured. And by the way, now the way that we take things for granted, like we can do a panorama picture with our iPhone, or that we can use technology to capture things digitally, he was out there doing it in analog form, so that he actually is not only part of the city, he is able to be a participant, but also an observer in and a chronicler of it. He's written our history. And along with, you know, his peers that came out, I think that connection back to Oklahoma is so strong because there's such parallels between, and this country's history is kind of embodied by this connection between Oklahoma and Los Angeles. We think of, and it's the wrong narrative to begin with because the country didn't need settling. It had native peoples that were here. But the first great one, you picture, you know, the covered wagons. The second one, it's the building of the railway, when in many ways it was the car settling of America that really, whether it was north-south in the Great Migration or whether it was middle of the country to the west, really defined how this country filled itself in. And I think that Ed's work really then captured that thing that Los Angeles does so well. Los Angeles is both a city and it's kind of a meta city. It's a place to see yourself in a mirror, as well as a place that actually has reality here. People often get that second thing wrong. Like, does LA have a soul? Of course we do. We're a huge filled city with amazing communities, but we're a mega city, like 19 million people, third largest economy in the world. And when I said everybody belongs here, it's because not that we have a singular identity, but you can find your place, and you can live happily with what Ed Ruscha has done, both the kind of the horror and the beauty of this moment and this place. And I got to say, in a year like this, in which we've lived through so much horror and beauty together, I think Ed Ruscha kind of has captured always ahead of the day where we are, and even proposed in the most subtle, provocative ways where we're headed. Both the city of Los Angeles So I think for our creative people right now, because people crowned us like one of the creative capitals, contemporary art capitals of the world in the last few years, we're not sure if we live easy with that. We liked it when it was more laid back, when it attracted the next Ed Ruscha of the world, when it was like you go surfing and be an artist, nobody really cared. And if you're into surfing, they're going to talk to you about surfing. If you're an artist, we'll talk to you about your art. But if you want to just hang out, we'll hang out. And that lesson of belonging to me is really what Ed has defined better than anybody else.
Yeah, very good answer. Quick follow-up question. How do you like the Dodgers' chances this year?
I love them. I love them. This was a great, great year. And really, we owe it to our farm team.
Well, I was going to ask Mayor Holt the same question. How do you like the Dodgers' chances this year?
Very good, of course. That is a OKC Dodgers hat behind him that I gave him, and OKLA once again. It's too irresistible a connection not to use it. You all use it for your exhibitions, and the Dodgers do as well. So yes, we are a Dodgers town now.
The only place you can get a Dodger dog. Oh, I'm sorry, Mayor. Go ahead.
I hope you're going to sell some of these with the chocolate. I think you can really sell.
I was going to say the only place you can get a Dodger dog outside of Dodger Stadium is in Oklahoma City. So, all right. So, well, thank you, mayors. I appreciate your responses to those questions. And the mayors may have to leave us at 4 o'clock, but we may continue a little bit after that. But I do want to now ask Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Olds another question about the exhibition. So the central thesis of the Oklahoma Contemporary Exhibition, OKLA, Ed Ruscha, is the influence of Oklahoma on the artist's career, and the exhibition in general explores the works that make explicit or implicit references to his home state. Beyond that quotation of place names and references to his youth, is there an indelible mark that Ruscha's upbringing in Oklahoma left on his art? In other words, is it possible to find Oklahoma in his depiction of a can of Spam or in his depiction of the Sunset Strip?
That's a great question. I think it is in a lot of different ways. I mean, with the example of the can of Spam, it's such a mid-century kind of icon. After the war, when what had been rationed during the war was available on the mass market, people all over the country were eating Spam. And Ed would have eaten that as a child in Oklahoma, maybe later on as a student in LA. So I would say that the kind of broader American culture of the mid-century that he grew up with in Oklahoma is always in his work. And also, several of us have mentioned this idea of horizontality in his work. And I think that is very much coming out of his Oklahoma upbringing. He will talk about the fact that he was a paper boy when he was growing up. He would deliver newspapers on his bicycle and really get to know the streets of Oklahoma City like the back of his hand. And I think that that interest in seeing a city through movement, that sense of horizontality that's so important in around Oklahoma and that part of the country, really translates into the way that he sees Los Angeles. So something like Every Building on the Sunset Strip, which is a book that chronicles every single building on that part of Sunset Boulevard in LA during the late 1960s, I think was quite influenced by his experience as a paper boy in Oklahoma City. And also, as he noted to us when we were putting together the show, technically Sunset Boulevard is an extension of Route 66. So that's another very interesting connection there. But I think his way of seeing the world and of seeing the United States and its landscape is very much influenced by his growing up in Oklahoma.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that, even in kind of the way of conceiving a pictorial space, not to get too kind of art historian-y, but you know, in Oklahoma we have these wide open spaces and incredible skies, and I think we see some of that space even in, you know, Ed Ruscha's paintings and prints too, right? That space at the top. But one other thing I wanted to touch on there was thinking about tone. oftentimes Ruscha, I think his maybe deadpanness gets attributed to California cool, which, you know, it certainly can be and is, but I think that there's something oaky about some of the wry matter-of-factness to a lot of his work, to the kind of its laconic nature that reminds me of, you know, kind of talking to older Oklahoma residents who've been here for a long time. So I think we see that too in the speech patterns.
Okay, well, thank you. Great answers, and I would agree. So I know that the mayors have to leave fairly soon. We've got about 5 minutes. Mayors Garcetti, Mayor Holt, are you okay with one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay, this is a question for the two of you, though. Do you perceive or foresee any sort of creative continuing partnership between Oklahoma City and Los Angeles?
Yeah, so, you know, Los Angeles is like a melting pot of a lot of American cities, right? There's a whole lot, they've poached a lot of brilliant people and a lot of great artists from states all over the nation. But I think it is pretty apparent to me that Oklahoma and Oklahoma City have disproportionately contributed to California and Los Angeles culture. You know, the Route 66 provides the literal connection. The Dust Bowl Grapes of Wrath period brought, you know, a whole generation of Oklahomans, not necessarily what we wanted to happen, but it happened, and it created, you know, I think a lot of roots for a lot of Californians that come back to our state. And then you look at, you know, some of the people, Ed Ruscha is one example, but you don't have to go very far in Los Angeles to trip over the name Will Rogers or the name Getty, you know, or the name Ed Ruscha, and then a whole, you know, lots of entertainers, obviously. I mean, it's kind of fascinating how much Oklahoma City and Los Angeles have been intertwined. And again, in a way that I think is really disproportionate to the number of people who live here. I mean, I recognize that LA's got connections to every city on earth, but Oklahoma City, you know, I think has a special relationship. And right now, I think you have a really unique moment that rises above even that. You know, the Dodgers are one example. Eric and I's friendship is another, but, you know, there's just so many different things that really make you wonder. I mean, it's really kind of an interesting moment. You know, Eric works every day with a city councilman there in Los Angeles, Mitch O'Farrell, who is from Oklahoma City. He works every day with his public works director, who's from Oklahoma City. You know, we've got a lot of connections. He's going to host, you know, the Olympics here in a few years. We're an Olympic training facility here in Oklahoma City. And for all those reasons, you know, Eric has been to Oklahoma City twice since I've been mayor, and I've only been mayor for 3 years. That's probably, you know, a lot more times than the mayor of Los Angeles has been to Oklahoma City in the last 50 years, you know, and it's all been crammed into the last 3. And, you know, he has been down Northeast 23rd and looked at, you know, the challenges we face there. He has taken a raft down the Whitewater Rapids of Oklahoma City. He has been in City Hall here in Oklahoma City. I mean, he is all but an honorary member of our community at this point. So I think there is infinite opportunities for continued connections between our cities and continued cultural exchanges between our cities. And I love that these exhibits, OKLA, both in their names, really reflect, I think, an ongoing relationship between two cities, you know, 1,500 miles apart that you would never necessarily think are that intertwined. But I think there is something there, and I'm very proud of it.
There's not much to add to my articulate brother, but you know, I think this embodies the answer to the question, right? 2 exhibitions, a friendship between 2 leaders that the moment we heard about it, we were already connected. If culture is sports, it's there. If culture is art, it's there. If culture is music, it's there. But I think the question is more than about 2 cities. It's about fundamentally this moment of us asking, what are we as a nation? Because most nations were nations before they became states, right? The people of Japan or of Italy or of Germany kind of had the culture in place before they formed the political boundary. We're backwards. We were a state before we were a nation. And we've been on this quest to figure out who we are. We've seen that painfully in this last year in the midst of a pandemic and racial justice calls and protests on streets and hyper-partisanship and hyper-libertarianism and hyper-everything. I think that Oklahoma and LA are both pretty mellow places in the end. Like if I have to define what defines Los Angeles, even as we grow up in a big city and become a little bit more frenetic, wide open spaces give us places to punctuate our lives, to think. These, the connection between our two states, our two cities really represents the connection, hopefully, that this country and this nation still has, so that we can see ourselves reflected in Oklahoma. When you ask the average Angelino, would say, huh? Does that make any sense? And then you point back that 40% of the immigrants or the migrants from Oklahoma turned left and went into Los Angeles, and half of them turned right and went up into our Central Valley, and that they changed and built this town, even if they didn't have a welcome. In fact, there were bum brigades trying to keep them away. And vice versa, maybe somebody from Oklahoma won't decide that they know what somebody from Los Angeles is all about before they meet her, or determine, what makes them tick. So I'm very hopeful that these things are not important, not just to reflect on the history of art, but for us to take stock and measure of who we are collectively through the eyes of a few people who have bridged our geography over these decades.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayers. I know that your time is precious, and you've spent an hour with us, and we really appreciate it. So if you need to sign off, feel free to do so. I'm going to hand it back over to Hadley German now, and I think the rest of us will stay on for any questions with the audience. But thank you so much for your participation and for the idea. I know that everybody on the panel greatly appreciates it.
Thank you so much, guys. Great to be with you.
Be well. Thank you.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you, Mark, and thank you to our panelists for this thoughtful discussion. It was really interesting and fascinating, and I know the mayors have stepped off, but we really appreciate their time today. Well, everyone, it's time in our program for our panelists to take your questions. So you can type those in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom window. And while you're doing so, I want to take a moment to shout out to a few of our distinguished attendees. We have on the call Patrick Blackwell, the artist, and members of his family, Christopher and Alexandra, his son and granddaughter. And in fact, I'm just going to take a moment, and while you're typing your questions, read this comment from Christopher, which is a really kind note. He said that he and Alexandra traveled to Oklahoma City to see both exhibits last month. They were overwhelmed by the experience. It was amazing to see the work that we have grown up with our whole lives being recognized with such admiration, hanging on the walls of two incredible museums in these collaborations. Thank you so much for recognizing Patrick Blackwell in both exhibits. We were delighted. Seeing the work of Ed Paul and the others was pretty great too. I just wanted to share that with our other panelists, and it was a real treat to meet you, Christopher and Alexandra, as well. We're so glad you could make the trip in the middle of a snowstorm. A couple of other comments I wanted to share with the group. Kim Baker in Paris, incidentally, has commented that as an OU alum, a Paris resident, and someone whose brother and family now live in LA, she's really enjoying the webinar today. So thank you for joining us, Kim. We have a couple of questions. One is for Alex. Alex, April Johnson has asked, how did Ed adhere the cocoa or chocolate to the paper, and how was it preserved? Would that have even been important to this type of work?
That's a great question. Thank you for that, April. It's a process in which he melted actual bars of chocolate. And there's a great story that he's recounted about when he first made the work in Venice. He and an American friend who were in town had to go around to like scores of little shops in Venice to collect enough chocolate in order to do the work. And it's a process in which he was able to silkscreen these individual pieces of paper, and then those were installed on the wall. They're not preserved. They change, metamorphose, or deteriorate, depending on how you want to think about it, during the course of the installation. So it's redone each time that it's shown. And in fact, there's a particular group who he works with each time it's installed in the United States, who have done it multiple times. So they came to Oklahoma City to install it for our exhibition. So when it's done, it's kind of done. The work actually belongs to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, but it's more owning the rights to it and to reproduce it than owning the actual object, because it does have to be redone each time it's exhibited.
Thank you for that. A question that actually came to me, an outside question, is if each of our panelists would share, if there's one work from your respective exhibitions that you would choose that best, to your mind, represents this kind of continued collaboration or influence of Oklahoma and Los Angeles on Ruscha's work, what would you choose? And I guess why?
Well, Kirsten showed the drum skin works in her presentation. They're relatively recent. They were done in 2018, 2019. But I think I would choose those. They're done on actual drum skins, which Ed has collected since the 1960s. And interestingly, only decided to use as part of his work a few years ago. But he has this longstanding interest in music. He talks about when he was growing up in Oklahoma City, he attended powwows and was really interested in the role of music and specifically of drums in Native culture. He also has made quite a few works that refer to popular music, popular American music. And then the phrases on them, he talks about as coming directly out of his memories of childhood in Oklahoma City. The kind of idiosyncratic syntax with the double negatives, he considers like this very specifically regional way of speaking. And he's talked about feeling sad that it's disappearing to some extent. It's this really sort of old time vernacular that he's celebrating with those. To my mind, his having taken the inspiration for them from Oklahoma City and then collected these drum skins over so many years and made the works in Oklahoma, that's a really great connection for me.
Yeah. Kirsten, do you have a?
Yeah, I mean, I think those drum skins are just fantastic works. You know, in some ways, maybe the little stake painting from 1962, it maybe seems like an odd connection there, but I think it brings in kind of some of what Alexandra was talking about earlier about, kind of eating spam and what Mayor Garcetti was talking about in terms of food culture, that idea of like ranching that gets at the span and the horizontality of the landscape. And I like the way it encapsulates some of his painting traditions, the use of kind of like the text, and it's functioning kind of like a caption, but for something that needs no caption. The kind of humor of the everydayness, the declarative nature of it. So I think that I think I'd pick that steak.
Okay.
And it's paired with the potato work. So yeah. Steak and potatoes, meat and potatoes, like very Oklahoma.
I just saw the show yesterday, and that's exactly what I thought. That's my grandmother's, that's the dinner we had at her house growing up. Mark, do you have a piece that comes to mind?
Okay, I'm sorry, remind me of the core part of the question.
a work in, well, either exhibition really, that really, to your mind, best speaks to this collaboration or this influence between Oklahoma City and Los Angeles?
In Los Angeles.
Mhm.
I think in the Fred's exhibit, it would really be the No Man's Land painting that I showed. You know, I talked about that just in brief, but the interesting thing about that painting is that it's also very much informed by the car culture that Ed really embraced early on. He was very inspired by the beat poets, especially Jack Kerouac's On the Road, even to going to the point of creating his own version of On the Road later on in his career. And so, you know, that painting is very much about an artist reflecting on his past in Oklahoma, thinking about his present in Los Angeles, and how travel, being on the road, has been a consistent part of his life at that point for what, 4 decades. Because, you know, when he left for Los Angeles in 1956, it's not like he didn't go back to Oklahoma. He did regularly. And so that painting is very much, I think, about that kind of migration back and forth between his home in Oklahoma City and his home in Los Angeles.
Mhm. We have a couple of comments in the Q&A. First of all, a staff member at OK Contemporary has let us know that 100 pounds of Hershey's bars were melted for the installation at OK Contemporary. So if you were wondering, that's a lot of chocolate. And then we had a comment from a faculty member at OSU wondering what other contemporary LA or OK artists or currents are running between Los Angeles and Oklahoma now. That would you all be able to speak to that? Maybe that was a question for our mayors.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I don't know who has their roots in Oklahoma that would be back and forth. Yeah, I mean, at the moment, all that's coming to mind are the 6 artists that we included in OKLA, but let me think about that for a second.
Okay. Let me see. Got another question in here. Actually, they're not questions, just a few comments from Teresa Long at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. Thanks for joining us, Teresa. And Joseph Schmidt, who's just commenting that, oh, he's just thanking us for hosting this panel. And I appreciate you all for participating. Well, I have a question, and it's really a question for Mark. So I'm afraid of asking you a question on top of another question, but maybe Alexandra and Kirsten could respond to this as well, because I know that Alexandra, at least, you're not in Oklahoma. And we were wondering, you know, you're an expatriate, especially Mark, at this point in your career, no longer living in Oklahoma, and what you've spent much of your career working on artists who are Oklahomans or from Oklahoma, and we wonder what you know, what importance do you see in their work in the cultural fiber of this nation? And you've really dedicated your career to working on these artists, and you're no longer here. Would you continue to do that? What significance do they have in your mind?
So when I'm from Tulsa originally, spent most of my life in Oklahoma, just for context, and kind of came back professionally in 2000 and was there from 2000 to 2020. And it was probably around, actually my first graduate school paper was on Dole Reed, an Oklahoma artist, but it was probably around 2003 that I really decided that I wanted to spend some time working on Oklahoma artists, because there was really a dearth of scholarship on them. And one of the things that I noticed very quickly was that Oklahomans were generally very conversant in what was going on nationally and internationally. They just didn't have the benefit of an institutional apparatus to really push them into the limelight, which is what one would find for much of the century in New York or Chicago, and then really only kind of the latter part of the century in LA. We tend to think of LA as a destination for contemporary artists now, but really when Ed and the guys went there, that wasn't really true. LA was just coming into its own, and their generation helped propel LA into the national and international spotlight. But yeah, Oklahomans were very knowledgeable and conversant in what was going on, and I just wanted people to take them seriously for their role in trying to find a voice for modernism in general, but any number of styles, themes, ideas that were also being discussed, being experimented with in New York City, Los Angeles, Paris, etc. As far as continuing to work on Oklahoma artists, I kind of saw OKLA as my sort of last project in that respect. I had a series of exhibits that I'd worked on at the Fred that I think tried to explore everything I was interested in. I'm not ruling it out, but it is, I don't have anything that I'm looking towards, so.
Well, there are a lot of Oklahomans who ended up in New Mexico.
There are a lot of Oklahomans who, well, a colleague of mine used to say that you could find more Oklahomans in New York City than you could in Oklahoma. And I think there has always been a desire for either good or bad for Oklahomans to leave the state and go elsewhere to act creatively. And, you know, and I have to apologize about the previous question. The only other artist I can think of from Oklahoma that went and made their career in California, though not so much in Los Angeles, was Lee Mulligan. And I'm sure there are people now that also claim Oklahoma as their home, but are working in Los Angeles. But I honestly cannot think of anyone. And so my apologies. Yeah, it's my ignorance, not the fact that it's not happening.
You can't know everything. Alexandra, Kirsten, would you like to weigh in on this Oklahoma expatriates conversation?
Well, I do think it's remarkable that such a big group of Oklahomans went to LA as part of Ruscha's group of 5 students. It really was its own little expatriate community. And I think that it was kind of along similar lines to how, you know, for example, I lived in Paris for a small amount of time and was very kind of quickly absorbed into the American community in Paris. I think it's sort of similar that newcomers to LA from Oklahoma, you know, found something of a home away from home among that little group. So I do think that's really interesting, and it kind of speaks to the strength of the Oklahoma culture there. I don't know, Kirsten, what are your thoughts on this?
So I guess I was going to flip it a little bit and think about the ways in which maybe Oklahoma now versus when, you know, Ed Ruscha and Mason Williams and his buddies were leaving Oklahoma. But actually, I think we're starting to see an influx of artists into Oklahoma. You know, I'm in Tulsa. We have the George Kaiser Family Foundation sponsored Tulsa Artist Fellowship program that's bringing artists from all over the place into Tulsa, and with the hopes that many of them will choose to stay once they finish their kind of fellowship period. And I think Oklahoma City is seeing some of that too, just kind of new energy and blood, people looking for opportunities and kind of the spaces, you know, time and kind of economic freedom to make work and supportive communities, places to show it. So I'm hoping that maybe we're switching the flow and bringing people into Oklahoma now.
I know that's a big goal of the Oklahoma Contemporary as well, to really make a home for many of the artists who are in the community. And I think it's very interesting, like a sort of upside maybe of this COVID era is that the traditional art centers are not, at least at the moment, as important as they used to be in terms of being shown or in terms of the art market. Since so many things are virtual, people are making art all over the country and all over the world, and it doesn't matter where you are to be part of these conversations because so many of them are virtual. And I think that that'll continue, at least to some extent, once, you know, eventually we're through this pandemic. But I think that there's kind of a democratization that's happening in terms of being able to participate in the market and to get your work out there, that really makes it possible to live anywhere and be part of your local art community and also be part of this bigger international conversation about contemporary art.
And that goes for museums too. I mean, we have participants in the audience today who are from all over the world, not just all over the country or the state. Well, I think it's about time to close, and I just want to take a moment and thank all of you for attending today, our attendees, and for your thoughtful questions. I want to especially thank the mayors. I know they're not here anymore, but we're so grateful for their time today. And special thanks to you, Mark and Kirsten and Alexandra, for sharing about Ed Ruscha and your respective exhibitions. As always, it is a pleasure to have artists and their families in the audience. And so we're really pleased to have Patrick Blackwell and Christopher and Alexandra and your families join us today. Before we sign off, I want to encourage all of you, all of our attendees, to visit Ed Ruscha OKLA, which will be on view until July 5th at Oklahoma Contemporary in Oklahoma City. I just saw it yesterday, and you have to see it. And I would also encourage you to make the trip to Norman this weekend. It's your absolute last chance to see OKLA in person here at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. So it's closing Sunday evening. You can see the exhibit online even after it closes virtually on our website, and I believe there is probably a link in the chat window if you want to do that. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists for your time and your thoughtful conversation today. Be well, stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you again online or in person, even better, sometime soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.